Hello, and welcome to our webinar on how to cope with exam stress. Now, the first thing I want us to do is to think about the causes of exam stress. And what I want you to do as a parent right now is to take a piece of paper or a notepad, and from your own experience as a teenager, I want you to write down the 3 reasons that you found exams most stressful. Once you've written down those 3 reasons, I want you to select the picture on the screen that you think best fits your experience of how you thought about and processed stress when you were doing exams. So first of all, we have this image here, like a weight is on top of you, whose pressure makes it feel incredibly hard to succeed. Secondly, perhaps that exam stress felt like a snowball growing bigger and bigger over time as stress piles up. And thirdly, perhaps you felt like an hourglass draining away until there's absolutely nothing left and you just felt empty and exhausted. Do that for me now. Brilliant, well done. So, here are some causes of exam stress. Talk to over thousands of students in many different places, all collated together from a variety of organisations that specialise in this. First of all, the feeling like you're not particularly ready or prepared. This can be when revision has been left too late. This gnawing sensation that you haven't done enough, that negative consequences are going to catch up to you, and this just builds and builds all the stress you're already experiencing. Secondly, worrying about how you feel, worrying about how you'll perform. This can be during the exam, and especially when you don't know what's in it, that fear of not knowing whether you revise the right things, whether you've spent enough time practicing on how long you should be writing specific answers for. This can build up a really horrible feeling of stress and anticipation ready for exam day. Thirdly, pressure from others to do well. This can be parents and carers or teachers, but that external pressure on top of the pressure the student is putting on themselves can cause a huge amount of stress with a variety of negative consequences. Next, pressure from yourself. Students want to excel and to do well. This pressure to achieve, to succeed, to get good grades can mean that the stress and the pressure build up over time. There could be difficulties at home or in social relationships. This could be with family, it could be with friends, and all those other really important things in life add on an additional amount to the stress already experienced preparing for an exam. And finally, coping with physical or mental health problems. The stress of an exam and this time can really exacerbate those problems. It can include worries about how those problems might affect a student in an exam as well. And it is really important to note here that stress is something that varies massively from person to person. Exam stress isn't only feeling the pressure of the exam either. It can be the pressure on the exact day as soon as you come out, wondering how you've done, and it can be holding on to this worry and constantly stressing over what your results will eventually be. So we've talked about the cause of exam stress. Now let's think about the consequences, the ways in which this stress can manifest in students. So I'm going to show you 4 pictures now. And I want you to write down the specific negative consequences that arise from these different categories. So first of all, we have emotional. This can be anything the student is feeling, the way they're experiencing, the way those emotions then manifest because of exam stress. Secondly, physical. The stress can manifest itself in unpleasant and detrimental physical ways, and these can get worse over time as well. Thirdly, we have thoughts. Now, this might seem similar to emotions, but this is more kind of how they picture themselves in this situation. These thoughts could be comparing themselves to others. It could be a general thought and fear of failure if the exams don't go well. And lastly, behaviour. How has the stress of the exam resulted in a behavioural change? Maybe quick to anger, maybe quick to upset. So for those 4 things, I want you to write down as many specific negative consequences that can arise from this as possible. Go for it now. Okay, brilliant. So let's start with emotional, and I'll put some of my ideas down. You can add them to your list as well if you don't have them. Emotional. could be things like anxiety, this sense of feeling overwhelmed, feeling trapped or feeling lost. There could be a feeling of just embarrassment, maybe even feeling like they're stupid because they're not doing as well as they believe they should be. Another one can be emotional exhaustion, just feeling so amped up, going from one place to another in your head, caught up in the general stress of exams and just feeling like you have nothing left to give. Then we've got physical. This can manifest itself in ways like forgetfulness. It can change eating habits. It can cause problems with concentration if they're constantly concentrating on revision and preparing for the exam at the expense of other things. Sleeping patterns can be disrupted, and actual physical illness, feeling sick, headaches and dizziness can arise from too much exam stress as well. For thoughts, we talked about those a little bit earlier, but fear of failure, comparing yourself to other people, worrying how will that person do compared to me? They'll definitely do better and I'll do awful. And these thoughts spiraling and getting worse over time if they're not addressed. And this fear of disappointing not only yourself but others is a really, really powerful thing. Especially students not wanting to disappoint their parents who've invested so much time and effort in helping them get to this place. Now they can feel overburdened by that sensation. It can cause really negative consequences. And lastly, for behaviour. These behaviours which can manifest when the stress is getting too much and can give us really negative consequences. It could be working too much. We will talk about this later in the session, but when it comes to revision, if you revise without breaks, not only is that academically a bad idea, it means you don't retain information as well, but it can really cause a lot of damage to students emotionally, physically and mentally. We may have behaviour changing in terms of no enjoyment in the things that they used to enjoy. The general stress has permeated everything, not just exam content, and it means they're not really happy during this entire period. And lastly, maybe we have just avoiding revision. That horrible sense of needing to confront something but just not being able to bring yourself to do it, and then the lack of revision will compound the exam stress. Now, while stress is normal and important to encounter to prepare teenagers to get ready for the stresses they'll undoubtedly encounter in adult life, the most important thing is making sure that the stress they feel from exams is manageable. If it's not made manageable, this can then threaten to overwhelm them. It can have a cascading effect, especially for teenagers, jeopardizing not only their physical and mental health, but having serious consequences for their future as well. So it is crucial we figure out as many ways as possible to avoid all these negative consequences of exam stress. So we thought about those consequences, and now we need to think of the way to tackle them. So here we are going to look at something that sounds incredibly simple, but actually is really important to figure out how to actually revise. And this is something that in my own experience as a teacher, many students don't think about. They don't have certain patterns, routines and processes that work for them to reduce that stress and embed the knowledge that's going to really help them succeed when the exam comes. So what I want you to do is to look at this list of different revision styles and methods on the screen, and I want you to identify the ones you've seen your teenagers use at home. And when you've done that, I want you to pick an option that you've not seen them use, but you think will really suit them. It will benefit their style of learning, the way they approach revision in general. So we have, first of all, flashcards, incredibly versatile revision tools. They help summarize learning and they help identify gaps in knowledge as well. Then we have mnemonics, rhymes or stories. This is just really helpful in memorizing facts. Mnemonics I learned as a primary school child about the planets in the solar system, I still have in my head today. And if you're juggling lots of different content and facts, breaking them down into tiny mnemonics just to get you going when you're in an exam can be incredibly helpful. Next, sticky notes. Really simple, but they are great for summarizing key information, and it's helpful to have sticky notes that you can categorize by color. For a subject like history, you could have one topic, the Cold War, but there are many different themes within that, with many different pieces of information to revise. If you color code those themes according to the sticky notes, visualizing that in your head come the exam can really help you get that good information down to earn some marks and do well. Then we have practice questions, one of the best ways to revise. Practice questions It's just familiarising yourself with the kind of content that might come up in the exam, usually from past papers. It also means that students can practice their timings in a relaxed environment, something that they really need to get down ready for the exam itself so they don't run out of time and lose that chance to succeed. Then study groups are an amazing option for revision. It allows students to test each other, and they can help test each other and support each other in a really pleasant environment that means they all engage and encourage each other to excel. Then mind maps. Mind maps, especially when you are looking at a huge amount of information in one place, really help identify common connections, and they're great for customizing, which really enables memorization. Different shapes, different colors, whatever your child wants to use to frame that information for a subject, having that mind map is a really good way to get the key information and have it all in one place you can look at the same time. And finally, just spreading out tests. It's natural that after revising a lot of things, you then want to test your knowledge. But this shouldn't always be done just after you've revised content. It shouldn't always be done in the same order at the same time. So you need to break this up, randomize it, because that is the main truest test of whether the information has really stayed in your head and you've understood it as well. Now, there is no one-size-fits-all option here when it comes to revision. What works for some students may feel or be completely inaccessible to others. Equally, a mixture of 2, 3, maybe 4 of these different methods will really help the revision process stop feeling monotonous and too boring for students as well. And the more methods that are used that work for them, the better that knowledge will be embedded in their heads, ready for exam time. Now, what needs to happen at the very start of the process of revision, when you have this huge period of maybe months leading up to the exam, is it is crucial to design, create and stick to a revision timetable. So you can see my example here on the screen. And this isn't fully complete, but illustrative of what yours should look like, made in conjunction with your child as well. This should be a collaborative process, not something imposed on them. They need to be involved in creating it. That gives them ownership of it, helps them understand the seriousness of the situation, but then it gives them that sense of pride as well. So you can see on the screen, maybe we have 1 hour where we're going to study maths, and in particular, we'll look at fractions. Now that 1 hour of study, whatever it's for, should be followed by a break of around 20 minutes or half an hour. Then we might do maths again for an hour, this time switching to a different topic like algebra. Again, we follow it with a half an hour break, and then maybe switch out to another subject, looking at English language for instance. On the next day after school, we might stick with English and focus on the writing portion, follow it with a break, then switch to a different subject, perhaps history, the topic of the Cold War. Again, follow it with a break. And perhaps at the end of the day, finishing off for history with a practice question. Now, if we fast forward and look at the weekend, obviously a lot more time that can be used for revision. It may be that the same subjects are done. It may be that we look at different subjects to spread out that learning across 1 week. But here again, and I cannot stress this enough, the breaks in between different revision sessions are crucial. Here you can see from 11 o'clock right through to the evening, we have 1 hour blocks of different subjects, different subject topic focus for each revision session, but there is always a half an hour break in between. Now, the reason for this is that if students are learning for generally more than an hour at a time, the longer they go on continuously revising, the less information is going to stick in their head. It might make you feel better if they revise for hours at a time. It may make them feel better as well, but it is genuinely counterproductive academically for keeping that information inside. And the longer students revise for at a time, the much higher chance there is of seeing those negative consequences of exam stress. This way, in collaboration with your child, if you sit down, you plan where the breaks are going to be, you stick to them just like you stick to revising the actual learning material, you're going to find this starts to alleviate a lot of the stress. It means you can trust your children with their own learning and check up on them when you need to, because everyone will know what needs to be revised and when. And finally, thinking about the exam day itself, the moment where the stress is absolutely at its peak. There are just some general simple preparation steps that can really help just before the exam, on the morning of the exam as well. They will go a large way to reducing exam stress and the negative effects that students are experiencing. Number one, prepare everything you need for the exam the night before. This might sound very basic, but as I said, I'm a teacher myself, and the amount of students I've encountered who turn up on a morning for the exam, perhaps to a maths exam without a calculator, find themselves in a huge state of distress. The stress has absolutely piled on top of the stress of having the exam, and just making sure everything is taken care of the night before. That way, the next day, step two, students can start their way in the best way they can possible. They've got everything they need already prepared, they can have a good breakfast, they can leave early to make sure there are no problems with timings. Number three, there are just simple and subtle, easy to learn breathing exercises. They can help just before an exam if students are feeling really overwhelmed. Building on practice question revision that we've already discussed, another step is just once you're in the exam, take your time to read the questions carefully. Quickly sketch out a plan of what you will write for the larger answers and how long you know you need to take, always checking the time as you go throughout the exam and finishing off different questions. There is no need to complete the exam paper in order. This next step, many students go from front to back on an exam paper and it works for them, and that's fine. But especially when timings can be an issue for certain students, there is no rule that says you cannot just skip to the biggest question worth the most marks and make that your focus to begin with. That way, if you end up running out of time towards the end of the exam, it's far better to quickly finish off the smaller questions worth barely any marks than having left the huge essay questions till the very end and knowing you're not going to get it done in time. And finally, students just need to remind themselves that they are giving the best they can. Their teachers know it, their parents know it, and they just need to remember that they'll give it their best go, the exam will soon be over, and this leads us to our final point. There will always be self-reflection. There will sometimes be disappointment following exams. Maybe this is warranted, maybe it's not, but either of those things are perfectly reasonable responses. But the main thing we need to remember is they shouldn't be dwelt on for too long. Waiting for exams and the results you're desperate to find out is always going to be hard, but there is no need to make it harder by punishing yourselves for perceived mistakes that can't be changed, that are in the past. So the best thing to do once all exams are done is just try to put it to one side. Replace that with doing pleasurable, fun activities that are purely focused on getting rid of the last of that stress and just getting you ready for what will hopefully be a really lovely results day. Hello and welcome back. And now we're at the end of this course on how to help teenagers cope with the exam stress and anxiety that comes with this really serious and intense period of time. What I want us to finally do is to think about our takeaways from this session. So the first thing I'd like you to write down, and this can be absolutely anything that we've looked at together here, is what is your main takeaway from this session? Maybe it is things to do with the causes of exam stress, thinking about things like those experiences and feelings we discussed at the start of the session, those reasons for feeling that incredible weight of the stress bearing down on you, feeling like stress just builds up and snowballs over time, or that feeling of just time being so finite, draining away like that hourglass. Those causes of anxiety, of fear and worry, sometimes that our teenagers just place on themselves that we don't necessarily realise. Perhaps your main takeaway was thinking about the consequences of exam stress, how this can manifest for teenagers, what shape does it take, either to do with their emotions and feelings, different kinds of behaviours that might occur, or even physical, serious changes resulting from all that anxiety and stress piling up. Another thing we looked at, and I think one that is really good as a practical tool that you can do with your children to really help solve a lot of those causes of exam stress, was thinking about those different styles of revision and creating the revision timetable. They're practical, actionable things you can do straight after this session. And the main thing we talked about was that in either of those instances, it's doing that with your teenagers, not telling them to do it, not ordering them, but collaborating with them and supporting them. And finally, we thought about things to do for exam day itself, those different steps of preparation, the different things we can do just before the exam day, even on the day of. Because we know that anxiety and stress that's there in the background anyway during revision, it can rear its head again. It can intensify on the exam day itself, that moment of the most pressure and most stress where all the hard work they've put in now needs to be applied. So think about which one of those things is your main takeaway, any aspect of that at all. And secondly, what I want you to do is to think about one thing from this session that you think will change your parenting in relation to how you deal with your teenagers and exam stress and revision. There are plenty of things here today that you may already do, but there are also things you may not have known about or may not have understood the reasoning for. Now I want you to think, what is one thing that you are going to take from this session and use in some way? Whether it's little or small is absolutely fine. And finally, on a really lovely note, thank you for participating in this session. And what I want to do now is award you 2 different badges. Because we've said here today that revising shouldn't be about telling teenagers what to do, loading them up with more unrealistic expectations, even more pressure than they've put on themselves. So the first badge I want to give you is just a supporter badge. You are there, of course, to make sure they're doing what they should be doing. Of course, they should be revising, but you're there in a supportive role. You're not there as a disciplinary figure handing out punishments for work not done. You're thinking about what is causing their stress. How is it manifesting? What consequences can we see? And in what way can you help them to alleviate that stress? And the second badge I want to give you is a collaborator badge. Because you aren't just telling your teenagers what to do, even if it is in a supportive way, you're actually working with them to figure out how to alleviate that stress. We talked about on the revision timetable section of this presentation, you need to be making that with them. You need to have discussions, set ground rules, give suggestions, help them where you can. And that means you're going to be a great collaborator, working with your teenagers to enable them to cast off that stress, to do the best exams that they can, and prepare themselves for what will hopefully be a really successful and fulfilling future because of the hard work you've put in alongside them to really help them excel. Thank you very much.